Cam here from Xano Support, and today we're going to get started with a really cool journey. What we're doing is we're going to be building an app together. We're going to be taking a look at a low-fidelity wireframe, and then we're going to be taking those ideas and putting them into use on the back end. The how do I do this is going to be answered in this video series. So let's go ahead and get started at the very top of our application. Let's think about the users that are going to be using our app and what rules and permissions we want to give them. Let's go ahead and jump in. So hopping into this project where we're going to go ahead and build out all of this cool stuff, we have to think at the highest level. Who are the users and what are they going to be accessing? What is the actual application? So whether your idea is on a napkin or it's on Figma through a flowchart or a wireframe, we have to think, what is the application actually doing? Who is it actually helping and handling? Well, in this case, what we're going to be thinking about are the users for our app, our admin, our user owner, and our guest. Our admin is going to be able to create and edit and delete and modify all kinds of resources. And our user owner, only their resource. And the guest can only view resources. So what are resources in this case? Well, it's a to-do app, so we're going to be creating tasks. The way that we think about how many tasks can be created and how we structure our data is another thing that we're going to take a look at in just a second. But at the very least, we can think about the user types, the admin, the user owner, and the guest. Thinking about these types as we start to build helps alleviate any pressure from anything else that arises in the future. Role access to start is definitely helpful. The way that we'll accomplish this role access is by leveraging Premiddleware, an awesome feature that Xano supports. Premiddleware is essentially a layer before your business logic of your endpoint. It's business logic before your business logic, or the way to handle your data before the endpoint does what it does. We pass in inputs, it goes to our Premiddleware, and our Premiddleware then crunches all of that information, or whatever we tell it to, and then it returns a response to our endpoint function stack. Then that endpoint, of course, returns a response itself. So Premiddleware allows you to use your inputs just simply before your business logic in the endpoint. Now, we have an understanding of what we want and why we're starting where we're starting. We're starting with roles at the highest level, and then we're accomplishing that with Premiddleware. Now, while we're on this page, though, we should also just take a look at the actual application. Now, it's a low-fidelity wireframe. There's not a whole lot of detail in here, but in our application, there will be a sign-up page with a name, a username, an email, and a password. We'll have a to-do or add a to-do page where you'll pass in a title, a due date, a task. And then also, you'll be able to query these to-dos or actually see these to-dos. And the idea here is that you'll be able to subscribe to these to-dos and, well, get notified via email when they've been completed. We should be able to show all of them or show only the ones that are active. And you can see that they are grouped here by the date and they have an order. This is your to-do list, so a signed in user on your user page. You should be able to see this edit button, this delete button, and you will hopefully be able to complete your tasks. Now, with that said, each wireframe is a little bit different, but you can tell that this task has a title and then has some content associated with it. And of course, then we also have our edit a to-do page. It's very similar to our create a to-do, but you can see here that we're dealing with, well, ideas. We need to take these ideas and solidify them and turn them into data. So we know that we're creating a user. So our user here will be where we focus. And we also know that we want roles. So we're going to be thinking about a user data table and a role data table, sort of separating our data. We know that a user is going to be adding a to-do. So we're going to have tasks, and we need a way to associate tasks with a user. And in this case, what we'll do is we'll leverage an additional table that will reference a user and will reference a task. With that, we're basically thinking about all of the data points inside our application. So let's go ahead inside Xano and take a look at our database that we have structured and set up now. Inside Xano on our dashboard, we have, well, I've created these tables already. I have a roles table, a tasks, a to-do list, and a users table. As I was going through the onboarding process, all of these were generated, or all of the CRUD endpoints were generated for me automatically. In my user table, it is authenticated with an email and password. Now we're focusing primarily on our user and roles, but of course, we will take a look at our task and to-do list. Let's start with our user first. We can see here that for our users, we have a name, an email, a password, a roles ID, and a username that we're collecting. Well, that roles ID, this column here, this is a table reference, which essentially is going to link a record in this table or a record in another table with a record in this table. We also have the ability to set rules on our database. So if we go ahead and right-click on a column and click Settings, we can see that they have certain things that we can do for them. In this case, the password, we can set filters that say the minimum length of our password should be 8, the minimum alpha count should be 1, so on and so forth. For our roles ID, we can also set a default value. Now, we will take a look at our roles data table in just a second so that this makes sense, but I'm referencing record 1 here as a default value. In addition to that, as the user is going to be signing up, we also want to ensure that usernames and emails are unique. Now, we can assign some conditional logic in that endpoint when a user does register, but we also have the ability to set these rules here using our indexes. We can go ahead and right-click on our index, and you'll see that I've added a username index here. That's a unique one. I've selected Create Index. I've changed the index type to unique, and then just selected username. With that, before we even add a user though, let's go take a look at those roles so that the default values make sense. You can see in my roles data table, I have a enum list column, which just is essentially a list of options. And then I have a description for what role each record is. So a user, a guest, and an admin. A user is a regular user, and guest is somebody that can view to-dos, and an admin is somebody that can do anything, essentially. Their IDs here are going to increment, but that's important to note here that ID 1 represents a regular user, because if we go back into our user table, and with that default value set of 1, that means anytime I create a new record, it's automatically going to default to that user role. Let's go ahead and add some users. I've added Chris's record here, and I've set him as an admin. So we have 2 users and we have an admin. I'm going to go ahead and create one more here, and we'll go ahead and add Louis. So we have 3 users that I've added to our data table. All of these roles here adding default. I did, though, select into Chris's record and set him as an admin. You should also note that if we add a record here where our table column is not null, so it's empty, and we have it unique, if we try to add another one, we'll get an error. You may see this message from time to time, and that's simply, well, it's because you have a duplicate record. And the best way to solve this is typically to set this column to null. We're going to go ahead and right-click on it, change the type, and then the nullable to yes, and click save. And then now we can go ahead and create additional records. So I just wanted to go ahead and let you know that that is an error that you will encounter from time to time, and there's definitely ways to solve it. Now we have our users here created, and we have roles also associated with them. Let's go ahead and head to our database tab real quick. In the database tab, we can actually see a representation of this information in JSON format. We have our tasks table, and we can see here that it has a table reference with that to-do list ID. And our to-do list has a table reference with our user ID. Now, it doesn't outright say table reference, but the way I know this is because I can click on Show Table Relationships, and it creates this very nifty diagram for us. And we can see how these items are communicating, where ultimately all of this information is going to come back to our user. So we can leverage our user information in our pre-middleware to, well, check the role and then check if that role technically gives them access to the resource that they are using. How do we go ahead and do that? Let's head to our middleware page, where in the top right, we'll click Add Middleware, and we'll give it the name of Access Control. The description, it checks if the user requesting this resource is the resource owner. So we just need a way or a system that checks if the resource that is being requested is the resource owner's. We'll change the response type to replace and the exception to critical so that we can go ahead and disrupt or stop any of the endpoint logic from running if we detect that this user isn't the right user. So what we want to do inside our function stack here is first query our user. That user is going to have a lot of information. And so we'll go ahead and select the database requests, and we'll get the record from our user. We'll go ahead and make sure that we're selecting the field name of ID and that the field value is going to be coming from the auth ID. That is, that this is going to be present on authenticated endpoints. So we'll leverage that auth ID. Now what we want to do is we want to check for the resource owner, and we have to understand that with Premiddleware here, as this information shows up top, well, we're actually selecting all of our inputs through this variable object. So it's going to be vars dot then whatever our input would be. And on some endpoints, it'll be a task that we're loading, and on some other endpoints, it might be some other resource, such as potentially the list. So we want to factor in the variability of this. And so let's go ahead, and after we add our get record, we're going to add a conditional. A conditional is up top. It's our if-then statement here. And essentially, we're just checking if this person is the resource owner. So how do we go ahead and do that? We have this blue pencil here, and what we're going to do is select our vars input. Again, it's an object. We want to go ahead and add a filter that's going to get a particular path. Now, in order to determine the right path, we need to know what our endpoints are going to be. So let's go ahead and very quickly head over to our endpoints. I won't save anything. I'll just leave this conditional here, and I'll head to my API, my default group. And what I want to focus on are the endpoints where we can either create or delete or edit these items. For these endpoints, we want to ensure that, well, we click on that lock up top and use user authentication. And so we'll just make sure that we do that for all of the endpoints that we're either going ahead and creating, that we're either going ahead and deleting, or that we're going ahead and editing. And so for all these endpoints, just make sure that authentication is enabled. And don't forget to publish. So after ensuring all of my endpoints that need to be authenticated are authenticated, what I want to do is I want to focus on what information is needed for them. And so if we look at our post or look at our delete or our patch, we can see that we're passing in our to-do list ID. And then for our users, our user ID, our tasks, our task ID, our roles, our role ID. So we have like the ability to look at our endpoints here and say, oh, okay, this information is going to be required for this endpoint, and this information is going to be required for this point, and so on and so forth. So knowing now that we're looking for certain information, such as our task ID that's passed into these endpoints, we can go ahead and segment or logic or add a conditional that says, okay, well, is it either a task or is it a to-do list that we're looking to process? So back in our middleware, we'll head to our middleware tab. What we're going to do is we're first just going to check, hey, in this blue pencil, our vars, we're going to use the get filter, which is going to crawl this object's path. And we're going to say that at the path of tasks ID, well, what we want to check is, hey, is it empty? Is there a value here? So we'll add another filter and say is empty. And this returns a true or false. So we want to check, is this empty, yes or no? And if it's not empty in this case. So we access all of our inputs using the vars object. We then select the path of our tasks ID. We check if it's empty. And if it's not, then we do something with it. So if it is not empty, that is our task ID, then what we can do is we can head to our database requests and we can go ahead and get this record. We can get our tasks record. We can go ahead and find the ID using our vars, and we don't need to use a get filter necessarily here anymore. We can use dot notation because that get filter, it prevents errors. If we use dot notation and there isn't a value at that path, we'll get an error, but in this case, we have it, so we'll just write out vars.tasksID. However, you can 100% use the get filter as well. We'll select our output here and we'll change this variable name to resource owner, and we'll go ahead and click save. Now, if it's not going to be a task, it's going to be a to-do list. So let's just do the same for our else logic. So what we're saying is, okay, well, let's go to database requests and we'll get a record and it'll be our to-do list because it's not a task ID. That means that it'll be our to-do underscore list underscore ID input that we need. So we'll do vars and dot our to-do list underscore ID. Amazing. Let's go to the output and change this to resource owner as well. Perfect. So we have two different outcomes. They both have the same name in this case. Now we need to do one additional thing. What we can do is we can take a look at our tasks, because the next question is, okay, well, how do we get the resource owner? In our output of our tasks, we can see that there is no resource owner associated, but we can see that in our to-do list, at the very least, we do have a user ID associated. So what we can do is we can update this resource owner variable. So instead of returning an entire object, we can return a particular path. Let's go ahead and click that blue plus sign, type out update, and select the update variable. We'll be updating resource owner, and the way that we'll be updating it, we'll be selecting resource owner, we'll use the get, and we'll select the user ID path. So the way I determine that is by going to the output, taking a look at all of the JSON, and saying, well, I need that user ID path. I'm going to make sure that resource owner equals only that user ID path here. And so I update my resource owner variable to be simply that user ID value. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for resource owner. I'll go ahead and clone that update variable and drag it under then. Now, if we select the task output, again, that problem is that that user ID doesn't exist. Now we know that the to-do list has a user ID, and we know that we have a to-do list response within this record. We can select this add-on here and actually enrich this data, make a connection here without needing to query any additional data. We'll just click that create a new add-on. And what we want to return is our to-do list that is going to have the user information. It's going to ask us if we want a list of items or a single item or more. I'll select a single item. And it's asking us how we're making this relationship between these two different tables. Well, our to-do list ID, it's going to be basically the value that we're using here to look at our to-do list table and to select its ID. Let's go ahead and select yes. So we're saying that we're mapping our to-do list ID to our ID column, and we're going to return it as to-do_list. I've just removed that underscore. And now what we have the ability to do is to take this output and update resource owner so that we have the user ID. So that'll be resource owner get our to-do_list get user ID. So let's go ahead and change our first to-do list. And let's go ahead and clone this get filter and change it to user_ID. So we're just using these get filters to find that path and to assign a value to our resource owner variable. Now, from here, what we need to do is, well, raise any alarm bells if the resource owner isn't the resource owner. What that means is we now need to introduce another conditional. Now, before we do that though, let's go ahead and highlight or hover over the three dots over this main conditional and edit the description. This is just best practice for if you need to come back, you'll understand what you're doing. And so we'll say checking the resource owner. Now, what we need to do is, well, we can collapse this and we can click this blue plus sign in our function stack header, and we are going to be adding a new conditional. So in this conditional, what are we doing now? Well, we are going to be referencing our user variable at the very top. We're going to be able to look at this user variable on their output and take a look at the role. So when we get the user, we'll check the role. What we want to start with is probably the admin. So if this user is admin, they're free to go and we don't need to do any other processing of the logic. So we'll start there. Selecting the conditional, we'll go ahead and then select our user one, and we'll use that get filter where we're selecting the path of roles ID. And in our data table, that admin is the value of 3. So we can hard code a value here of 3, and this checks the admin. Let's go ahead and edit our description to checks admin. Awesome. So after it checks the admin, what's next? Well, now it needs to check if this is the actual resource owner or the user who owns this resource. Now, because the condition is checking if this person is an admin, that would mean the then statement would trigger if this user is an admin. We can actually leave this blank because all that means is that then the logic will proceed to our response, and we don't have to worry a whole lot about that. So we're going to perform the rest of our logic in this else statement. Now, what we can do is we can add a function, and we're actually, believe it or not, adding another conditional. So let's add another conditional here. And inside this conditional, if they're not admin, then we need to check the resource owner and make sure that they're the right resource owner. The way that we can do that is by clicking on this blue pencil and selecting our resource owner variable, which will just represent the user ID value. And so we say resource owner, it will need to equal our user1.id. Now we can, of course, I want to actually get into best practice of using our get filter. So we'll just type in get ID. Now we need one other check here. We need to make sure that they are the user role, that they're not a guest. And so we'll go ahead and select our user1, and we'll go ahead and get our roles ID. We'll make sure that this is going to equal that value of user, which we can again hard code as the value of 1. We'll go ahead and click save. And so the question is, okay, if they're admin, they're going to go ahead and pass. Now, if they are the resource owner, which is what we're checking here, then they can pass. Otherwise, we need to throw an error. But before we do that, let's go ahead and edit our description of that conditional, which checks if this user is the resource owner, and click save. The next step would simply be if this user isn't the resource user or is a guest, what we would do is we would throw an error. And the way that we can throw an error is by heading to our utility functions, where we have a bunch of cool functions that we can use. What we want is not to throw error, but we want this precondition. This precondition is going to just stop all of the logic from proceeding and throw a uniform message back to the user on the front end. A condition needs to be true in this case for it to not trigger, which means we need to introduce an argument that will always be false. This is the very end of the argument chain. And so using this precondition, we can set a conditional. What I like to go ahead and do, like 1 equals 2 or A equals B, just a thing that just is always going to be false so that this message always triggers. You can use the same logic that you used in this condition up here. Otherwise, I like to just keep it simple. So I will go ahead and set that 1 equals 2 so that a message is always thrown, and the error message will be, this resource doesn't belong to you. The payload, if you feel like this was an error, please contact this site admin. Sure, why not? And then the error type will be unauthorized. So we'll go ahead and click save, and we did it. Now we can update this though, the user. We don't need the response here because all we really need is it to work. That is, we just need it to trigger and to check, because what we have here is a check that'll automatically stop this resource from being loaded or created in the event that this is assigned to an endpoint. Now that's the next part about this. We need to go ahead and publish our middleware. So I'll go ahead and publish that. And now what we need to do is actually assign it to our endpoints to test. I want to head to our database real quick, where what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just ensure that we have tasks and a task ID associated with a user. We'll focus here on user 1. So user 1 will create them a list. And we'll call this Cameron's list. And we'll go ahead and add a task to it. We'll assign that list that we created. We'll assign a task. And the order will be 0. The due date can be today, and it hasn't been completed. Let's add just another one real quick, just to make sure that this is going to work the way that we want it to. So after I add my tasks, what I'm going to want to do is remember these IDs, because I'm now going to want to assume the role of a different user that isn't Cameron, and I want to see if I'm able to trigger an error message. I'll head to my API group, where specifically I'm going to be deleting a task. And so notice that here it's been authenticated. We're going to go ahead and head to this delete endpoint. I'm going to go ahead and delete a task. And so I open up my endpoint, and the first thing I need to do is add the Premiddleware. There's 2 ways to do this, but I'm going to choose the way where I'm individually adding it. I've clicked on my settings here, and I want to navigate to middleware, where I'll customize my response and I'll add a Premiddleware. It's the access control, the one that we had just made. So I'll go ahead and click save and publish. And what I want to do is I want to run this, and I want to go ahead and run this as Louis because he doesn't have access to my resources, hopefully. And we'll go ahead and just run task ID of 1. So perfect. Louis can't delete this, but can Cameron, who owns this, delete it? And so far, it doesn't look like Cameron can. So if we just go ahead and troubleshoot this real quick, we're getting the record from our user using this auth ID. So This would be Cameron's record of user 1 that would return this information. We're then going to check those resources. So we're checking our task, and we're saying in this case, our conditional is, well, we're checking our vars and tasks underscore ID equals false. Let's go ahead and make sure tasks underscore ID. Okay, so that's the right variable name. Then what we'll do is we'll get the record from the task. It doesn't look like I saved that add-on that we had created, so I'll just go ahead and save that real quick and publish my change. I'll head back to my endpoint and I'll try one more time with Cameron, and it looks like that null response is working. Let's just double check with Louis one more time with that other task that we had created. Perfect. It isn't letting him delete it. Now, I do want to check with our friend Chris. Chris is an admin, and it doesn't really matter if it's his or not. So if we run this again, it looks like Chris can also delete this. So what we've been able to craft so far is from our app here that we're taking a look at, we've been able to craft a pre-middleware that acts as a check for the roles and the resource owners. Again, starting at this high overview or this higher level of thinking when we're going into our app development just ensures that as we're continuously developing, we can, well, mitigate errors and navigate those kinds of challenges with a little more ease. Heading back into Xano, I do want to just go ahead and show you one additional way to add middleware. That's at your group level. You can go ahead and select middleware and apply this middleware to every single endpoint. So going ahead and selecting this would automatically apply it to every endpoint. I'm going to stick on that case-by-case basis here for our middleware just to demonstrate its functionality, but I did want to introduce that additional option. With that in mind, we now have a fully functioning role-based access system that's going to check the user and the resource owner. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those in the comment section below. And in the next video, we're going to be going over the registration process and, of course, creating a task. So until next time, have a good one.